Hello, guys. Forgive us. We've been having some technical problems, but we seem to be here. I'm John Elledge. I'm a journalist and author. Many years ago I used to edit a website called City Metric, which gave me an odd taste for wandering around slightly depressed British towns and wondering what to do with them. And it is often, frankly, a lot of towns are a faintly depressing experience. So it feels like a lot of our high streets have been hollowed out. Rather, there are all sorts of explanations for that. Obviously, the pandemic is a big one. The rise of online shopping, uh, general austerity, and the decline of town halls. And the rise of out of town retail, all of which put together means that it does just sometimes feel like the country's rather depressed, and that's obviously not a great state for anything to be in, is it? There are some particularly depressing stats in this report, Department Stories, which is out today from Power to Change, of which my favourite is probably that. Where are we? Forgive me, it's here somewhere. Just 7% of shoppers plan to do most of their Christmas shopping in department stores, while almost half say will do most of their Christmas shopping online. Given that, I think I'm right in saying something like a quarter of retail spend is meant to come in the run up to Christmas, that doesn't feel like a good sign. Um, but there is some hope. There is also the report contains some great case studies of things we can do with department stores by turning them into community assets and handing them over to community groups that can make them kind of keystones for a sort of new type of high street. So that's very much what we're going to be talking about today. I'm going to very quickly introduce our panel before turning over to Jessica from Power to Change to actually kind of talk us through the report in a bit more detail. First off, as I mentioned there, Jessica Craig is the policy manager from Power to Change and the author of the Department Stories report. We'll also be hearing from Graham Salt, who's a retail consultant with Canny Insights. Catherine Chiswell-Jones, who's the CEO of ArtSpace LifeSpace, and finally Julian Dobson, who's a researcher on this kind of topic from Sheffield Hallam University. I think with that, we'll turn over to Jessica, who's going to talk us through what the report found.
Thanks very much, John. I'm really excited to be able to introduce this report today. John said there's obviously some kind of depressing statistics, but I like to kind of think of this report as a bit of a good news story in the lead up to Christmas, because it centres on 4 fantastic community businesses who are doing something really creative, really unique on their high streets. Oh, I'm in a booth in the Power to Change office, and sometimes the light just randomly turns off. But yeah, the report centres on these kind of 4 fantastic community businesses who are doing something different on the high street, and with former department stores and shopping spaces. The report is part of Power to Change's work with community businesses to take back the high street. So we work with communities to test interventions that can help them to take ownership of more spaces on the high street and to have a say in the governance of their high streets. And then we use that learning to advocate for policy change. I want to give you a quick kind of overview and flavour of the report, but as I said, the 4 stories in it are fantastic. Please do check them out and engage with our kind of policy recommendations as well. In terms of the origins of this paper, so Power to Change has previously looked at how community businesses are tackling high street vacancy and creating a more diverse offer for the high street. So I was aware of a couple of examples of community businesses that were already occupying these kind of larger scale retail assets, like Sparks being in a former M&S, and Catherine can tell you all about that later. So I was curious about, the kind of specific challenges and opportunities of doing community-led regeneration on the high street at this kind of scale and in this specific type of assets. And when we started delving into department stores specifically, I think they're a really interesting case. They seem to have kind of held this like important place on our high streets historically and kind of in our society as well. But we've seen that role really shift as the way that we shop has changed, and we've kind of moved to, as that statistic that John mentioned reveals, moving to shopping much more online and also kind of out of town, away from the high street. So yeah, back to that kind of that stat. So we've done some really interesting polling with More in Common for this report, which kind of shows where people are going to be shopping this Christmas and also looks at kind of where people shop usually. There's a kind of quite a marked decline of people shopping on the high street around Christmas, which might just be, people trying to avoid the crowds. But there is really kind of no change from, the rest of the year to Christmas around people's engagement with department stores, suggesting that it is just now really, really low. And that reflects that kind of transition to much more kind of online and out of town shopping. As a result, we've seen a marked decline in the number of department stores on the high street. So one statistic that we reference in the paper suggests that about 85% of traditional department stores have closed in the last decade. That includes big brands that we'd all recognise like BHS, Debenhams, Beals. But we're also seeing some of those big high street names like Marks and Spencer's, like John Lewis, shifting their emphasis towards their online sales because that's where they're seeing growth. There is also something interesting about department stores that we've kind of uncovered during this research, and that's the purpose that they hold for a lot of people beyond shopping. So acting as a social space on the high street, a place to meet friends, get coffee, get off the high street, take a breather, use a public loo that's free and usually clean. And I think a lot of us will have memories associated with department stores, particularly around Christmas. So I know for me, growing up in Edinburgh, there was a particular independent department store that I would always visit to see a really giant Christmas tree. And lots of us might be familiar with that experience of going to see Christmas lights displays, taking children to Santa's grotto, that kind of thing. So they do hold this kind of this space in our hearts and public imagination. So kind of putting all of that together, there's obviously empty department stores from the brands that have disappeared. There's also an oversupply of retail space generally. So it's clear that there's a kind of a new life needed for these department stores that goes beyond just retail. And so community-led reuse of department stores presents a sort of ideal opportunity to revive that like civic or social role of department stores. You've got Catherine on the panel who can tell you all about the story of Sparks, but just to give you a flavour of the 4 case studies that are featured in the report and what they reveal about the kind of role of community reuse and regeneration on the high street. They're all sort of approaching the regeneration of these spaces in quite different ways, and they've got different kind of focuses. So Sparks is focusing on sustainability education. The Haven Community Hub in Southend is supporting older adults and people with dementia. Department is creating an arts and culture hub for the community in Ryde. And the Dewsbury Arcade, when it reopens next year, is going to provide a space for local entrepreneurs to trade from. So kind of different themes. But there are also a lot of commonalities in the approach that these 4 community businesses are taking. So they're all trying to revive that social function of the department store, be it through their cafes or providing activities that are sort of low cost and accessible, or providing space for people to just be on the high street without having to make a purchase. So I thought it's really interesting to kind of see coming out in the research that there seems to be like a real appetite for space that people can go to in the town centre, that's free to use, that lets them meet other people, but where they don't have to, shop, or they don't have to buy something to use the space. They're also all helping to diversify what's available on the high street and bring in a range of new sort of experiences, opportunities, services that help to increase footfall and have benefits for other local businesses too. Most of these projects have got kind of some element of retail within their offer, but that's wrapped up in a sort of truly mixed use experience that gives people a reason beyond shopping to come to the high street. We've also observed some kind of common challenges faced by these community businesses taking on department stores. So from a practical perspective, a lot of the buildings are kind of older, they require quite a lot to maintain them and make them accessible, and that could be really costly for a community business. There are also some challenges around security of tenure. So raising the funds to buy a department store can be challenging. These are often expensive assets in sort of like prime retail spaces, even if there is kind of a level of vacancy. And if you look at the report, you'll see that Age Concern Southend, who run the Haven Community Hub, are actually trying to buy their assets so that they can secure the long-term future of the work that they do in Westcliff. But they've been caught up in the freeze on the Community Ownership Fund. So some challenges around kind of asset ownership, but also if you're leasing, especially if on a kind of short or meanwhile lease, it can be really tricky to attract the type of investment that helps you put money into the asset and maintain it so that you can make it work for your community. And community businesses might be hesitant to kind of raise money and put lots of investment into an asset if they don't know if they're going to be there in 1, 2, 3 years' time. But kind of following on from those challenges, I do think that it's a really kind of ideal time for government to help address some of these challenges. We've seen growing policy momentum around tackling issues on the high street. The former government, the Conservative government, had introduced the Future High Streets Fund and laid the foundations for what has become the high street rental auctions that came into force just over a week ago. And then the new government's plan for high streets also includes introducing community right to buy, which is going to be really helpful for community business, and plans to equalise business rates for high street businesses and the online giants. I think that's all really positive, but for communities to be able to grasp these opportunities and to pursue this new kind of civic model for the high streets to replace the outdated retail dominated model, they're going to need a cohesive package of powers, support, and funding. And the report therefore makes some recommendations around how you bring this package together and make use of other tools like local growth funding and business rates reform to back community-led action on the high street. We also know communities want to be able to take that ownership stake in the high street. So the report includes some recommendations on how government, also working with local authorities, can unlock community ownership, including by getting that community right to buy legislation right and ensuring a successor to the Community Ownership Fund that enables more strategic support for community asset ownership. These recommendations are all informed by the work that we do on the ground with community businesses and stories, just like Catherine's with Sparks. And we're going to be continuing to kind of work with community business to test and learn what works to support community-led regeneration on the high street. My kind of last point is looking to the future. In 2025, we're going to be working with a new cohort of community-led high street innovators to test solutions to issues of community ownership and governance on the high street. So do look out for that next year. But yeah, please check out the report. I think these stories are wonderful, and there's some really lovely pictures that kind of bring to life what these community businesses are doing. But I think that's probably enough from me. So I'll hand back to you, John.
Thank you very much. It's a truly fascinating report with some really interesting case studies in it. I'm next going to turn to Graham from Canny Insights to kind of give us the broader retail business context, to kind of just talk us through the wider business context in which all this is happening. Graham.
Okay. So yeah. I had a look at the report and I kind of pulled out three key themes really that I felt especially resonated with the work and experience and the trends that I'm seeing on the ground in the places that I work. And I called those three themes place, community, and curation. And the place one, it got me thinking, why are these buildings important? What is it that links Bristol and Ryde and Southend and Dewsbury? And I think although not all these buildings are department stores in the strictest sense, you heard from Jess, all of them have performed as retail anchors in the past. And I think what is important as well is that all of us find, I think, that that it can be complicated and quite unsettling to navigate life at the moment because things are always changing around us. And I think what's important about these stores and why people feel like they are important to them is that they do provide a sense of continuity and a sense of rootedness that in a sense is ripped away when those stores are no longer there. Also, of course, it's worth flagging from a kind of architectural point of view that in many cases these are also attractive buildings, handsome buildings, often the most eye-catching buildings on those high streets. And in many cases, they embody beautiful elements of local distinctiveness too. So I went to Havens a year or two ago, and the brand of Havens is kind of woven into the architecture, almost into the glass and the decoration. And so I think those kind of all those kind of factors and the points that Jess flagged before are reasons why people are passionate about what happens to these buildings in the first place. onto the second theme that I flagged, and community. And I think I worked as a high streets task force expert over the last 5 years. And that was very much around exploring and empowering these issues of localness, distinctiveness, bottom-up working. Um, and certainly from what I see on the ground, of course, there are all kinds of factors that we can't change or we can't influence, like business rates, cost of living, and so on. But I think there's an important theme that a lot of the answers to high street challenges are ones that are local and in the hands of people who are working in those places. And one of the things I often like to reflect on is that after many years of becoming almost more like each other, high streets are arguably becoming more interesting again. And I think crucially, independents are assuming more importance and taking on the roles of being place leaders, if you like, almost everywhere. So I do quite a lot of work in Chesterley Street up here in County Durham, and I've been tracking the uses of the buildings over the last decade. And if you go back a decade, 2014, uh, um, indies accounted for 60% of the retail and leisure occupants in the town. It's now 70%. And that, I think, is reflected in lots of places. And the Dewsbury Arcade is a wonderful example of how local independents are taking the lead in terms of creating a community-run shopping centre. And the final point, curation. I think it's one thing for communities to have ideas about bringing empty retail buildings back into use, but of course it's another thing to make that happen. And you may well be aware that one of the things that I do is I play retail Cupid in various places where I match up occupants and premises, and that has seen some real successes in places like Durham, where I think businesses that might otherwise have got stuck in the system have the advice and the encouragement and the signposting to help them achieve their dreams, if you like. So it's often about working together with all the key partners in a place to, I guess, create and curate the high street that you want. And it's worth flagging as well that although there is a sense in some places that retail is taking a back seat, don't think that retail on the high street is dead by any means. In Durham, I have retailers who want to trade in the city, national retailers who want to trade in the city, who can't find the right space. So it's often a more nuanced picture than we see in the media. And so I think the final point then, it's really pertinent that your report is raising these questions of how do we enable places and communities to achieve more of the positive change that all of us want to see. And clearly a lot of that is driven from the bottom up in the local places, but it's absolutely true as well that government has a really important role to play in putting in place some of the building blocks that help us achieve things locally.
Thank you, Graham. That was really. I was particularly taken with the stat about the increase in the number of indies out there, because that is a positive story you don't often hear. We often think a lot about kind of like the decline of the high street. We never think about the opportunities this is creating for smaller businesses. Next, I think it would probably be good to hear from someone who's actually working on the ground. Catherine Chiswell-Jones is as the CEO of ArtSpace Lifespace, which is responsible for Sparks in Bristol, which is one of the case studies. So, Catherine, over to you, please.
Thank you very much. I'm very excited to be here to talk about Sparks. It's a venue that's located in Broadmead. It's in the heart of Bristol's shopping district. It's a former Marks and Spencer's building, and it's a massive 108,000 square foot former landmark store that we have repurposed as an innovation space, essentially focusing on sustainability creativity in art and education. And it serves as a hub for the community, blending retail with interactive exhibits, workshops and events. We describe ourselves as the department store with a difference. We have different departments that are dedicated to things like fashion, food, nature, gifts, sustainability. And we offer recycled goods. We have repair services through our repair cafe, which runs on a Sunday, and visitors can explore lots of art installations. They can enjoy educational programs that are run by Global Goals Centre, who are our partner in the project and help co-found Sparks. And they can come and participate in workshops and pop-up events. On the first floor and second floor, we also have space for artists with affordable studio space and event space for community use. Interestingly, before we took on Sparks, we were actually looking at another out-of-town retail unit. We were working to connect a community group with the affordable or free space. Unfortunately, that fell through at the time because the owner decided that rather than avoiding paying their business rates through giving free space to artists, that they would instead engage in box shifting practices. And it was around this time that we were connected with the Marks and Spencer's building by a charity management company called Hammonds. And the building was really exciting to us for a number of reasons. Number one, it was 2 minutes away from our flagship building, the Island. So it was a relief not to have to travel far. But also, we had really noticed the knock-on effect when the Marks and Spencer's closed for our flagship building and artists. The whole area started to feel a lot less safe. Shops started closing down. So we were really excited at this prospect of coming in and working with a landlord who felt a sense of obligation to actually steward this building and reanimate the high street, and in a way that would give us the opportunity to provide this affordable space for artists to make, rehearse, showcase and sell their work, which is at the heart of what we do. We also felt that an iconic building like this provided a really brilliant opportunity to provide a visible model that would show the impact of investing in culture in our high streets. And it was around this time that we thought about taking it on, that we were introduced to Global Goals Centre by Bristol City Council, and together we decided that it would be brilliant to partner, and we created a shared vision and manifesto for Sparks. So we often hear in the arts that audiences are hard to reach, but we felt that Sparks provided this brilliant opportunity from not only its location, but the footfall in the area, and that by blending retail, art and education, we could create a space in the city that represented the diverse communities who frequent Broadmead. So before we even signed the lease, we brought those communities together to try and discover what it is that they wanted and needed. And we held an envisioning workshop in November of 2022 with over 50 local organizations, individual artists, and just really tried to figure out how we could support the work of as many local charities and community groups as we could. And out of this workshop, that's when we developed together this idea of a reimagined department store, working with lots of different partners to create each department. And we really wanted it to be more than just a retail space or an art centre and education space. We wanted it to be a really dynamic hub for creativity, education and community engagement. A big part of that was working with Bristol's community champions. So 10 of the community champions in Bristol worked with us to ensure inclusion of local people. Often these are people who don't really get a voice in what happens in city centre developments. And so we now have almost 20 representatives of different communities across Bristol. Everything from the Pakistani Welfare Organization, the Polish Women's Group, Chinese community and many other organizations. And their input was really vital in helping us develop a community space on the ground floor and advise on what kind of cultural events and opportunities to trade within the store. So it was way more than just our charity or Global Goals as a charity. It was so many people that fed into what Sparks should be and could come. And I think that's what I see is really most inspiring by all the case studies, is that it really demonstrates an amazing collaboration. And since we actually have started Sparks, we've had nearly 800,000 visitors since May 2003. We've saved thousands of items from landfill. We've given 35 tours and talks to other groups to help spark change in their own cities and towns. And our latest Google review describes Sparks as one of the best things to come out in Broadmead in years, which I think is fantastic. I'm really, really excited by the recommendations of this report. For example, making communities the first resort to take on assets on the high street. Like, often we see that community asset transfer teams are giving the property dregs, and they ask communities to convert these liabilities into sustainable assets, and they're often not backed up by any startup funding or support. So proposals to the government for the Civic High Street Accelerator and on funding for community ownership are, I think, really key to empowering communities. And I also really applaud the proposals to create this fair model of business rates that rewards people restoring the high street and closing down the loopholes in the law to obtain rate relief, and clamping down on practices like soft stripping to avoid paying rates, as well as expanding the scope of eligible assets, which can really, I think, help us create a fairer, more equitable high street.
Thank you, Catherine. That's really interesting. Last but not least, we're going to turn to Julian Dobson, who is a researcher at Sheffield Hallam University, who has described the demise of the high street as Britain's new deindustrialisation, which is a very nice line, Julian. Well done. Thank you. Please tell us your thoughts.
Yeah, so clearly high streets are in a difficult state. I mean, this has been going on for many, many years. It's one of the reasons why this report is really welcome, and some of the recommendations that are really timely, particularly with the government having a bit of a reset about its thinking on the future of high streets. So I'd just like to make 2 points, really. One's about vitality and the other's about viability. So first, vitality. I think what's come out of this report, what's really clear from the examples that are shown, and especially from what Catherine's just been sharing with us, is the emotional importance of some of these places and buildings. You know, that people feel a really strong attachment to these places. When John Lewis closed in Sheffield a few years ago, people put little hearts on the windows saying, you know, what they'd appreciated about John Lewis, how they always used to come there and do their shopping for Christmas, how they liked particular members of staff, how they found them hugely helpful. And that's great. You know, it shows that people do love these places, but at the same time, the model of department stores that we're used to doesn't work anymore. So we need to find different ways to bring that vitality into town, to bring that sense of attachment, that sense of love. You know, government policy is great at creating conditions for things to happen. It can't make people love their high streets. It can't make people rediscover that attachment to place. But what it can do is create the conditions where local people taking initiatives like we've just heard from Catherine can start to put back in place the things that connect people. And it's those connections that we need to think about. So first of all, then, the vitality of place is about those connections. It's about people having those attachments. But we also need to be realistic about viability. So again, in Sheffield, Debenhams is currently up for auction. It closed about 4 years ago. The asking price for Debenhams in Sheffield is £1. So if any of you have got a spare quid, you can have Debenhams. You might need another million or so to make it worthwhile and usable. But if you've got a spare quid, put in an offer for Debenhams, and then what? So the story that you've heard from Catherine is a story of immense hard work. it's a very rewarding story, but there's a lot of work that goes behind that. And so for a community organisation to take over a high street asset, it's got to be able to stay the course. It's got to have the resources it needs. That's why the recommendation on restarting the community ownership fund is really important. A few months ago, I was in Sunderland, where the local community organisation Back on the Map has done really important work in bringing properties back into use in a street called Valletta Road. But it takes time, it takes support, and then you've got to have a means to make it work long term. That's why the viability side of it is really important. So community ownership is great. Community reuse of department stores is fantastic, but it's not a magic wand. It's not going to solve every problem on the high street. If you take a town like Hastings, where there's actually quite a cluster of community assets, you also find that there are also a lot of empty shops. It doesn't solve all the problems, and there aren't enough community organisations out there to just take over every empty shop on every high street. So we need to be strategic about this. And I think particularly if we restart the community ownership fund, it's about identifying those strategic properties which can make a catalytic difference to the area around them, so that those community efforts are actually directed as intelligently as possible. And so I think we've got some really good examples of what can be done in this report. We need to think about how those examples can be replicated and new ideas seeded at very local levels, because it is that local imagination and creativity that makes the difference. So national policy at its best creates the conditions for local people to do things well in their own way, and that's what we need to be looking for.
Thank you, Julian. That's an interesting point about Debenhams in Sheffield. There are 63 people in this chat. I was just working out, if we have about 16 grand each, we can probably save Sheffield between us. So maybe we'll think about that afterwards. Quite keen to get some questions from the floor, so please feel free to add those to the chat. But to kick us off for the Q&A section, I'm gonna turn back to Jessica, the report author, and ask. You didn't want to. I think you didn't want to spend too long on your kind of asks of government, because we obviously had a lot of panelists to hear from. But do you want to take a moment to just kind of talk through the report's recommendations and what you would really like to see in policy terms?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, John. And yeah, it's great to kind of hear from the other panelists how, they kind of what they think of the recommendations, and good to hear that people think they're kind of timely and relevant. I think there's kind of two sort of goals with these recommendations, and these sort of span across this report, but also a lot of the other work that Power to Change has been doing recently. So you'll see a couple of the recommendations crop up in my colleague Josh's recent paper on kind of getting that like technical community rectifying legislation done properly, so that it can really enable communities to take ownership of assets everywhere, but also on the high street. There's two kind of overarching goals with these recommendations. So the first one is for government to play a role in enabling communities to create that more sort of civic model of the high street. So to do that, we would want to see government kind of bringing together those emerging powers, so community right to buy, but also the kind of the right to rent powers in the high street rental auctions, and sort of other powers that are available also to local authorities to help communities take ownership of assets. Bring those powers together with, as others have said, the resources to actually, take those on, maybe to own or to rent, to kind of put the work into, making those assets suitable for community use through the case studies. Kind of just bringing a building up to kind of accessibility regs seems to be a big kind of feature. So a lot of these community businesses having to put quite a lot of money in just so that people can get from, the ground floor to the first floor. So all of these kind of practical challenges around getting a building into shape. Also the support. So, you've got kind of examples of exceptional community businesses doing really interesting and innovative things. But if we want to kind of seed more of that, there needs to be the support for more people to kind of, take on these assets and turn their ideas into something really tangible for the community. So saying that all kind of wrapped up together, rather than a really disparate sort of policy landscape and bits of money where communities kind of have to go cap in hand to different people, to government, to local authorities, to trusts and foundations, kind of seeing some of that brought together in a really ambitious way. The second one is kind of around that, the community ownership picture. So I completely agree with what Julian was saying around a much more kind of strategic model for enabling community ownership. It's clear that the community ownership fund that the previous government brought in has been really popular. It's been received really well by community groups, but it's also had a lot of challenges. And so, some kind of practical around actually how you access that funding, but also around the kind of this framing of, assets that are at risk of being lost from community use. So I'd really like to see the government taking a more strategic approach and thinking about what's going to enable communities to kind of take on assets for community benefit, but also to deliver that kind of local economic benefit, because they're, investing in these assets, investing in their communities, excuse me, and putting money straight back into the local economy. And then also the kind of environmental benefits of reuse. So one of the recommendations in this report and in some of Power to Change's other recent work is around kind of changing that understanding of what assets communities should be able to use the new powers to take on. So we want to see in the community right to buy, communities being able to take on assets that maybe previously haven't had a community benefit or community use. So that could include former retail assets, but identifying strategically what assets on our high street in our communities are going to enable us to empower local people, put money back into the local economy, and kind of steward our high streets and our planet effectively. So yeah, that's kind of a bit of an overview of the direction of these recommendations.
Can I just ask one big question? Just I'll stick with you for a moment, Jessica, but then I'd be interested in other panelists' thoughts as well. Who are the community? Like, how are they constituted? Is this separate from local government? How are we defining this?
Yeah, I think it's a really good question. And I suppose Catherine's remarks speak to the way in which community business kind of tries to bring in as kind of broad and diverse a range of perspectives as possible to shape these spaces for the widest possible community benefit in the widest possible sense. If we think about kind of like retail, department stores, these kinds of spaces, they're relatively, they might be quite anonymous. They might be kind of somewhere that all of us can kind of go to from lots of different walks of life. And so I think there's something really interesting about how community businesses are trying to like replicate that accessibility and inclusive nature. In terms of, what is community and does it include local government? I think our work on the high street demonstrates that there is a real role for a relationship between community businesses and other high street stakeholders, including local authorities, but also including, for-profit businesses, bids, and other sort of, private landlords, anyone who's kind of got an interest and a stake in the high street. So some of the work that we've done previously with Julian around piloting this idea of community improvement districts as a way for communities to kind of take a leading role in the governance of high streets demonstrates that the way to get things done is often through a collaboration between all these different types of stakeholders. But we're still seeing that community businesses are really struggling to get a seat at that table. And so it is up to some of those other stakeholders, particularly local authorities, to make that space and to make the resources available for communities to become a part of the conversations about what happens on their high streets. And community business is a really good vector for that, because these are businesses that are kind of locally rooted, so in a particular place, and have some kind of accountability to the local community. That might be through their governance model or through other means. And so they're kind of hearing what people want and need, and then they're able to filter that into this kind of strategic vision for the future of the high street. So really welcome the idea that local authorities should work much more with their communities. And one of the recommendations in the report is actually about how you use local growth funding and regeneration funding to do that. And I'd like to see much more partnership working between local authorities and communities through organisations like Community Business to decide how that investment's spent at the local level.
Julian, I can see you nodding through some of that. Would you like to come in on this question of like how we're defining the community and making sure they get a seat at the table?
Yeah, thanks. I think we should not get too worked up about having a definition of community, because a community is all sorts of things. So local government represents a community in one form through a democratic process. But if you look at a cross-section of your local councillors, do they necessarily represent every interest in the community? Not so, because it's a political process. Community businesses that are owned by and accountable to local people are another form of community. Arts organisations are another. So if we think about what's often known as civil society, groups who come together to get things done or to share an interest, that's what we're talking about, and that expresses itself in all sorts of ways. So I think the point of the community improvement districts idea was to say that as opposed to business improvement districts, where only businesses have a say in what goes on in an area, we want to widen that out so that other types of community interest can be there and have a seat at the table. But what goes on in the end is never going to be kind of statistically representative of every interest in the community. What we need to think about is does it express the life of the community in various forms, and does it open up the possibility of new community interests coming in and finding a place to do the stuff they want to do? And that's always going to be a dynamic and changing process.
Catherine, do you want to come in on some of these issues? And also Chris Hill would like to know how long you think Sparks are going to be able to occupy the M&S building.
Sure. First of all, just Sparks lease is currently until December 2025. We're hoping to extend beyond that, but at the moment we tend to renew our lease annually. So we've had our lease renewed once, we hope to renew again. It's going to be quite difficult because there's going to be a lot of redevelopment, and Old Debenhams is due to come down, the Gallery Shopping Centre, which is right opposite. We're sandwiched in between two big developments, and actually without this store being here, you could create this big, just a construction site basically right in the heart of the city. So we hope to be here for quite a while, ensuring that the community comes in, and by community, that is the people who come to the high street. It's really varied, but it's also outreaching to people that don't live in this area. So there's a lot of people that are living within the area, but there's a lot of people that come from outside the suburbs of the city and from outside of Bristol to come in here and do the shopping that they can't otherwise do, or socialize, or have experiential events in some way. The community does also include the local authorities, the bids, and all the different arts organisations and people that come here for events. So it is very varied. And it's how you include those people. You try and include as many people as possible, but you're not always going to include everybody's voices.
Just while we're with you, would you also like to, someone would like to know if there are any successful examples of high street community assets from smaller towns on the periphery of our big cities?
Absolutely, yeah. Definitely, there definitely is. I can think of one that is absolutely brilliant. It's by Little Lost Robot Studio, and they were based in Twerton, and now they've taken on the Radstock Old Mill in Radstock, and they're running everything from youth music programs with teenagers to welding workshops to family sessions. It's really important that we have these community spaces cropping up, and I think there is a lot more opportunity in these dying high street towns to have more of these community spaces, particularly when you're in a smaller area and smaller town. You can end up feeling quite isolated, which is often why people come into the big cities, but we need to retain these community hearts in smaller towns as well.
We've had an interesting question from Julia Roebuck, who notes the prevalence of alternative fashion and textile practices. And she's wondering if the panel have any thoughts on why community high street initiatives would be so attractive to sustainable third sector orgs and small businesses. Graham, we haven't heard from you for a while. Would you like to come in on that and any other points arise?
Yes, I'm not sure I have a particular view or insight on the fashion thing, but I wanted to just pick up on 2 points. So in terms of local examples of things happening in smaller towns, one of the places that I worked with a high streets task force is Prudhoe in Northumberland, a small town, about 10,000 people. And the work there that the Prudhoe Community Partnership is doing, a charity, is really worth looking at. They basically built their own community building, but it hosts the police and the library and the council, and the PCP is even a landlord of some of the retail units around there as well. So it's literally a charity that is one of the kind of major drivers of Prudhoe as a town. And it's I was really impressed with the work they were doing when I went there. Also picking up on Julian's point about community improvement districts, I think it's a bit of a red herring in a sense, because it's worth flagging that a lot of bids, the best bids, are already involving the community in a really effective and deep way anyway. So I work quite closely with Durham Bid, and they work very closely alongside Durham Parish Council, for example. A lot of the independents in Durham, those are the people who are taking the lead and being on the bid board and representing more diverse views and experiences. So I think it's worth reminding ourselves that although bids are called business improvement districts and they're paid for ultimately by the businesses in that area, a lot of them are working really hard to make the community part of it, because ultimately it's not going to work if it's something that is kind of imposed on a place. It needs to include those voices anyway.
Rodri Burnett would like to throw a bucket of water over the discussion and has a rather more negative perspective. He says this has been quite a positive framing of the potential regeneration of the high street. Can any of the panelists address the challenges of dealing with powerful stakeholders that don't share such a positive community framing and that only want to sell their assets to the highest bidder? Graham, let's stick with you for the moment and then we'll go to the others.
Yeah, I think this whole issue of who owns the high street is really important. It's something that I often bang on about. I think although few buildings are in the hands of what you would think of as the community, in the places that I work up here in the northeast, we're fortunate in a sense that a lot of the important retail buildings in places like Durham and Chesterley Street are actually owned by local landlords. And I much prefer that to buildings being owned by someone in God knows where, because at least if it's a local landlord, it's usually somebody who is a bit invested in that place and cares about who they have in their building. So I think that's an important thread as well. And so I would much prefer a situation in the future where, rather than being seen as the kind of assets that have some kind of notional value and just send money away to somebody in London or abroad, it should be that these buildings are owned by the businesses and communities that have got a vested interest in the place, because we know from experience that creates better places and more interesting businesses.
I mean, I think that's undeniably true. And I think I don't think you'll find much disagreement for the idea it would be better for places to be owned by community groups than London-based property groups, whatever it is. But we deal with the world as it is. I mean, how do we kind of make sure that what are currently being treated as assets are kind of treated as more as community assets, I suppose? Jessica, can we go back to you?
Yeah, can I come in on this one? I think it's a really good question, and I think that Rodri is right to be realistic about some of the challenges, particularly in a place like London, where the market for assets is really hot and the cost is, sometimes absolutely astronomical. Of course, it's incredibly challenging for communities to kind of get onto that like ladder of ownership. In terms of what we can do about it, so I think policy wise, we need carrots and sticks to get people to come together and to talk about, what we could do differently with assets, particularly those that are just otherwise vacant. And London and lots of other places are going to have lots of those assets. So thinking about the high street rental auctions that have just come into force, my take on that process as it's currently set out is that it's quite lengthy. It's probably very resource intensive for local authorities to use, but I hope that it can kind of be effective as a power of last resort, and that it will encourage some landlords to kind of come to the table before it gets to that sort of enforcement point, and to recognize that actually they should be doing something different with their assets. Another kind of area is kind of around the business rate stuff. I think Catherine referred to kind of the various sneaky ways that people try and avoid paying their business rates. So Catherine mentioned box shifting, which is where you put boxes of anything really into a vacant asset, so that you can get a business rates holiday. People do this with all sorts of weird things, including I've heard snail farms in central London. It's just not appropriate. It's just not right. Also, I think Catherine mentioned, and it's language that we use in the report, soul stripping. So people that are intentionally vandalizing their assets so that they can have them declared not fit for occupation and avoid paying the business rates. That is not an appropriate solution to having a vacant asset. There are people who really, really want to make these spaces productive. I would like to see proper enforcement around business rates avoidance in its many different forms. And when government is able to get these people paying the business rates that they owe, can we reinvest that in making more resource available for communities who want to take on those spaces? And then lastly, just to kind of address the London context and that kind of the cost and hot market sort of stuff, I do think there's a place for kind of more strategic, more agile funding so that communities can get ownership of assets in these places too. So that's why Power to Change is calling for the creation of a British High Street investment vehicle. So it's a kind of strategic fund that would be capitalised by government, but also by social and private investment, that would enable assets on the high street that communities want to get access to be bought up quickly, to be able to kind of compete with the fast-moving sort of private property sector, and then allow those assets to be transferred into community ownership over time and with support. So we think that's something that would really kind of help to address that specific challenge as well.
One of the things I found genuinely quite inspirational about the report is all these stories of department stores being reused in a way that you don't necessarily have to be spending money to enjoy. But that does kind of feel like it's sort of pushing back against our entire prevailing ideology of the big property firms who own this stuff, but also of like local councils who have a fiduciary duty to kind of sweat their assets and so on. And it just sometimes feels like we've kind of lost this. We've lost the language for a right to be in a space that doesn't involve that isn't a financial relationship. Julian, would you like to kind of speak to some of these issues?
Yeah, that is a really interesting point, and I think it's not just the buildings, but it's also the public space around them. So if you look at a lot of new shopping developments, for example, or new office developments, actually the public space is privately managed and it's very securitized. It's full of CCTV cameras and it can be closed at any moment. If you're not seen as a kind of desirable person, someone who's going to spend money or have business in that place, then you can be excluded. So I think you're absolutely right in saying there's a case for actually opening up a lot of these places to the public. I think with buildings, with ex-retail buildings in particular, you've always got to ask the question of what kind of use is viable and how's it going to have some longevity, because otherwise you just have a succession of temporary uses, and people's energy runs out. So you actually need to start to build assets within communities for the long term. So I think that's it's really important to sort of start to be strategic and long-termist about it, but also think about how we can create permeable spaces where people can move in and out without the need to spend money, so that all members of the community are included. And you can do a lot of that through public space by creating places for people to sit, for people to be, for kids to play. Play is something that has been excluded from a lot of our public spaces, and if we just bring that back in, if we create safe places for kids to play, then that kind of keeps the parents and the carers in the place, and they'll probably spend a bit of money as well while they're there. But it brings life back into the place, and so I think you start from the life of the place and build up from there, rather than start from what can we monetize and how can we extract as much value from it as possible.
It's interesting you mentioned kids, just because I often feel like another problem we have is just like the strong desire that teenagers cease to exist anywhere they can be seen. Feels like it might be a factor in some of the decline of the high street as well. We are very short of time, so just to kind of wrap up, I'm just going to go around the panel, ask them for their one policy recommendation. What is their single biggest ask that they would like to see from the government to kind of address some of these issues? Graham, let's start with you.
Okay, I'm not sure. I think, well, I would like to see a High Streets Task Force Part 2, because I think it's currently being evaluated. It did a lot of great work in building capacity in local authorities and communities all across the country. One of the problems is that a lot of places, even at council level, haven't got the resource to do all the things they want to in their town centre. So I think a reinvented High Streets Task Force that provides a resource that can be sent into places to work with them is something that would be really valuable.
Catherine?
Oh, that's tricky. I want to pick two, but I'll pick closing down the loopholes so that we can actually access these buildings in the first place.
Short and to the point. Julian?
And just to follow that up, so we've got Catherine's recommendation. Now we can, on the back of that, kickstart the Community Ownership Fund, give people the money to actually get these things done.
And finally, Jessica.
I've got 7, and I would like everyone to read all of them. But yeah, I guess kind of tying all of those things together, just that kind of cohesiveness across the kind of the policy picture, to bring all these things together and understand how they interact, to make sure that the power, the resources, the kind of support are all lining up across different government departments, because obviously this sits across different places in government, and then also between central government and local authorities who are kind of leading some of this work on the ground. So yeah, that coherence and that kind of sense of bringing it all together to actually get stuff done.
Well, thank you, everyone. With apologies to those whose questions we didn't quite have time for, but I'm going to read this out from Brendan Conway. Well done, Jess. Excellent report. Thank you to all our panelists for a fantastic discussion. And I hope everyone takes the time to kind of read that excellent report and kind of read all 7 of those recommendations. Thank you very much.